Welcome to Exploring Kabbalah, an introduction to an ancient Jewish mystical tradition. In Judaism, as in many other religions and spiritual paths, stories known as parables illustrate deeper truths, as well as spiritual and moral lessons. One parable about a king's crown jewel offered at the conclusion of Episode 2 by Rabbi Ari Solish illustrates why the mystics began to share Kabbalah's wisdom with an audience beyond a select group of scholars.
There was once a king whose child was deathly ill, and the king brought in all of the greatest physicians, and no one had a cure. They tried this, tried that, or the other. Nothing would work. Finally, there was one physician, one expert that came in and said, "I have one cure, but I'm afraid to tell it to you." He says, "Tell it to me." He says, "There's a mineral that possibly, if it's mixed in the right way, with the right amount of liquid, etc., there's one mineral that might serve as a cure to your son, but I'm afraid to suggest this." "Why are you afraid?" "Because it's actually the crown jewel of your crown, the crown jewel of your own crown. That's where that gem is. The only one that I know of in the world is your crown jewel. So the only hope for your son is to take out your crown, ruin your crown, take out the crown jewel, grind it up into a powder, mix it with liquid, and then try to administer it to your child." So the king says, "It's not a question. Of course, let's do this. It's for my son's life. Sacrifice the crown for my son's life." And so indeed, this is what they do. They grind it up. And at this point, the son is so ill, he can't even swallow. But somehow they open up his lips, they open up his mouth, and they pour it in, and most of it spills out. Most of it is wasted, but a little bit gets in. And that little bit of this potion or this cure gets in, and indeed begins the healing process for the prince, and the prince is healed. So the mystics, and I'm talking now about like the Baal Shem Tov in the 1600s and 1700s, and the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, and the subsequent mystics. So they brought this type of parallel to explain why it is that we need mysticism more than ever today. Because in general, it's harder to be spiritual today than perhaps in the past. And because of that, we need a jolt of spirituality. We need an infusion of the deepest secrets. Whereas it was always thought we have to protect the jewel, the crown jewel, from the masses. You know, it's not good to share it to everybody, people that might interpret it or might waste it. It's gonna dribble down the king's mouth. It's not a good thing. It can't be wasted. It can't be discarded like that. But the conscious decision was made that if it can revive the prince, then it's worth all of the effort. So the reason why I say that is because there was a decision made, and the current status is that Kabbalah ought to be taught, and ought to be taught to a broader audience, specifically because of its spiritually therapeutic properties, because it brings about spiritual clarity and healing, which as a world we need a lot of that. We have enough pain and suffering. We have too much pain and suffering in the world, too much darkness in the world, that we need an infusion of tremendous light. So herein lies this, and in Kabbalah lies tremendous light. So the conscious decision was made that we have to spread it out more than ever before. And so the way Kabbalah is taught today, bringing it forward to the 21st century, the way Kabbalah is taught today is in a way that can be understood by the masses. Doesn't require necessarily a expertise in all of the other areas of Jewish thought. So whereas before one would have to build up to this point, a person can perhaps start with Kabbalah now, today. And the idea is Kabbalah is so beneficial that it's like a first steps in bringing about spiritual clarity and healing.
And one of the key concepts of Kabbalah is that of Sefirot, which translates in English to luminaries. The singular is sapir.
Sapir means like radiance, kind of like Zohar's radiance, but Sefirot also means points of radiance. So the very quick version of the Sefirot is the following. Kabbalah explains that God in his essence, and I use his, although God is not gender specific, it's just, I guess in English, typically the gender that's used for God, although again, God is not a he or she, God does not have a body, but God in his essence is beyond any definition and any limitation. So the Kabbalists explain, how do you get from an infinite God to finite creation. Is it just a big jump from infinite to finite, because God can do anything, including create finite? Or is there somewhat of a logical progression from one to the other? And the Kabbalists explain, indeed, there is somewhat of a progression where God first emanates 10 divine powers that he then uses to create the fabric of the universe. So these are 10 energies that God uses and that are embedded within the fabric of creation. So you have, I mentioned the 3 intellect. Now, the way we look at them from a human perspective is that 3 of these 10 are intellectual and 7 are emotional powers. Now, it doesn't mean that God is intellectual or emotional. And I'm not saying that God is not intellectual or emotional. God is, in essence, is beyond all these types of definitions. But again, as God assumes, if you will, the modality of creation, God takes on these, or God projects himself through these 10 points of radiance.
The Sfirot, also known as the Tree of Life, includes the energies first in Hebrew, then in English. In some teachings, the highest level is Keter, or crown, in addition to Chochmah, wisdom, Bina, understanding. Some traditions add Da'at, or knowledge, along with Chesed, love, Gevura, discipline, Tiferet, compassion, Netzach, ambition, Hod, yielding or humility, Yesod, bonding, Malchut, royalty. These attributes are linked, interdependent, and believed to explain the very process of the creation itself.
Now, this requires a lot of, this requires sessions for itself. I've taught classes where each of these 10 is a full hour-and-a-half session. So there's a lot to this, and that's scratching the surface of it. Many thousands of pages of Kabbalah on each of these energies. But maybe an analogy that's helpful in kind of contextualizing what does this actually mean is imagine you have a really creative artist. Now, this artist is so creative that he or she could create using any type of medium that's available. Paper, clay, metal, paint, charcoal. Doesn't matter what music, the written word, poetry. This is an inherently creative individual. So you take this person, or they take themselves. They put themselves in a room, and in front of them they put a canvas and a palette with 10 colors. And using those colors, they create a masterpiece. So there's 2 points here. Number 1, is this masterpiece, is this work of art that they just created, does that constitute the totality of their creativity? Of course not. They're creative beyond this individual expression. On the other hand, the second point is, does this express some of their creativity? It certainly does. But it expresses it through limitation, because they're limited to these 10 colors, and they're limited to this one palette, this one canvas that they're projecting their creativity through the 10 colors onto this one palette. And the same thing we could say is true of God. Again, it's not a perfect analogy, because God's creativity is infinite, whereas the human artist, no matter how creative, is still finite. God has infinite creativity, infinite possibilities. Even infinite is probably a limiting word, but it's the best word that we can use, right? God is unlimited on any level. God chose, for whatever reason, God decided to create 10 colors and then to use those to paint the universe. God takes God creates or emanates 10 sfirot, and in using these limited tools, creates the fabric of the universe, and then embeds these same 10 energies into the human soul.
According to the mystics, that the divine energies are implanted in the human soul reveals the meaning behind the biblical text found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. In the English Standard Version, it reads, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them."
And the Kabbalists say, well, what does it mean in the image of God? Image of God, since when does God have an image? If God has an image, you're looking at the wrong God. The Jewish God doesn't have an image. So what kind of image is this? It's blasphemy. It sounds wrong. The human being is created in the image of God. What, God has a body? God has hair? God has eyes, God has a nose. What kind of human God is this? In the Jewish conception, God is not some old guy sitting on a throne. That's not a thing. There's no body. So what does it mean that human beings created in the divine image? The Kabbalists explain. In the divine image, as God projects the 10 sefirot to create the universe, God embedded these same 10 powers within the human soul. Like I said before, what exists on a cosmic level is paralleled within us, and what exists within us is paralleled in the cosmos. So we have these 10 powers, and the way we understand them is the intellectual powers, the emotional powers, and that's how we operate. We operate with creative wisdom, with analytical wisdom, and etc. Again, this would require another exposition for itself to explain all 10 powers, but the easiest way to understand, the short answer, the easiest way to understand the 10 sefirot is by looking at how they exist within us. Because how they exist in the universe is going to be a little bit esoteric. But that's why the later Kabbalists seek to explain the ideas more about how they exist within us, because that's relatable. So the later Kabbalists from the 1500s kind of on will say that what are the 10 sefirot? To understand it, let's look inside. And let's see, how does our mind operate when we think? How does our heart operate when we love or when we have to discipline others? How does that work? And when we understand that, now we can have a better inkling about how it works in the cosmic realms. But that's a little bit about the sefirot. They're energies that God uses, the palette that God uses to paint this universe, but it does not represent the totality of who God is and what God could do. It's just as God chose to limit himself with these 10 powers, not 9, not 11, just 10. Why? Who knows? Right? 10 powers on this specific canvas, and that's the art that God creates.
And while the Kabbalists sought to deepen the understanding and connection to biblical text, Kabbalistic references also commonly appear in Jewish liturgy, that is, in prayer.
For example, the Friday night prayer service was largely, not the whole thing, but some of it was introduced based on the Kabbalists. In fact, probably the most famous prayer of the Friday night service, the Licha Dodi, was authored by a Kabbalist in the 1500s, Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. So he straight up, in fact, the Licha Dodi prayer in the Hebrew, if you take a look at each stanza, the first letter of the stanza, spell out his name. So his name is embedded in the prayer. It's right there in the prayer, and it's something that if you're familiar with the Hebrew, you could just open up the prayer book and see it. The first letters spell his name. So that's very significant. And the whole idea that Friday night is a time of meditation and prayer, that was really enhanced by the Kabbalists.
And likening the Sabbath to a Sabbath bride.
Sabbath bride. Well, that actually originates from the Talmud. The Talmud it first speaks of sages that used to greet Shabbat and call it the bride. But that was really lived by the Kabbalists. The Kabbalists in Safed used to go out into the fields Friday evening, and they used to literally welcome, as the sun set, they used to physically be there in welcoming the Sabbath queen, Sabbath bride, etc. So you have a very strong Kabbalistic influence on Friday night, on Shabbat. The liturgy, the Siddur, the prayer book, the traditional Jewish prayers were formalized by the Anshe Knesset Hagdol, the men of the Great Assembly that lived between the First and Second Temple eras. So we're talking about 2,500 years ago. There were 120 great sages, probably the most famous of which was Mordechai from the Purim story, one of the heroes of the Purim story, Mordechai and Esther. So he was one of the, quote, men of the Great Assembly. And they structured, they formulated, formalized. Those prayers were always recited, but they kind of, nailed down the text of the Jewish prayers, the daily prayers, the holiday prayers, etc. And what's interesting is that in our tradition, it says that they made sure to align the prayers with the Kabbalistic intentions as well. In other words, although the prayers can be understood and have meaning on a very basic level, it also has Kabbalistic kavanot, intentions, and what I'm looking for, meditations built into the text. You have to know how to learn it, and Kabbalists teach how to pray in the right way. But yeah, so you have within prayer, which is a very normative Jewish experience that is not necessarily associated with mysticism, in addition to the Friday night prayers, which is mystical in origin. Part of it is the Lecha Dodi is written by a Kabbalist. But in addition to that, all of the prayers were attuned to, if you will, the Kabbalistic frequency of how to communicate with God as well.
And I was also just thinking of, Shalom Aleichem, you're welcoming in the
angels. Right. Why, since when do we
got the angels?
Since when do we welcome angels, right? Since when is Judaism talking about angels on such an obvious, we talk about, Jewish law and kosher and Shabbat and that thing. We talk about angels. Again, it's Friday night, and it has a mystical idea behind it. That Rabbi Ari Solish should be passionate about Jewish mysticism is no mystery. So I grew up in a Chabad community, and Chabad is a movement within Judaism that is on the. It's hard to kind of encapsulate Chabad in one word, but I would say that it's a movement within Judaism that is very open. It's very open and loving and welcoming for Jews of all affiliations and all backgrounds. So on the one hand, it's very, in a sense, low barrier of entry. It's kind of like it's out there. It's like the public menorah lightings on Hanukkah. That's typically Chabad. It's Judaism that's made very accessible. At the same time, Chabad, the foundations of Chabad, are some of the deepest mystical teachings. Chabad actually stands for Chachma, Bina, and Dat, which means wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The three powers of the mind that Kabbalah speaks of at length. So Chabad at its core is very, very mystical in its philosophy and in its teachings. So I grew up in a Chabad community in Pittsburgh, and from a fairly young age, as a teenager, I began studying mystical texts, Kabbalistic texts, and Hasidic texts. And as I journeyed through my studies in yeshiva, I studied more and more. And then I actually got to a point where I was brought on by the big Chabad publisher in Brooklyn to begin translating Kabbalistic texts. And I did that for a number of years before moving to Atlanta. I still write, but primarily I teach. I know some Kabbalah, I know enough to be dangerous, and I seek to share that wisdom with others to lift up, to inspire and to lift up spirits and to bring this positive Jewish teaching into people's lives. And it's transformative. So that's really what I do in my objective. At the same time, there is a spiritual component to it as well, which I think you're touching on, which I'd like to share for a moment. There's another reason given why, in these latter centuries and generations, why Kabbalah has become more and more mainstream. And that is, from a Jewish perspective, we're getting closer to a better world, which is known in Judaism as Mashiach, which is, in English, the word would be the Messiah. And I'm not focusing on a specific individual, but a time of enlightenment. Maimonides, the great Jewish writer on Jewish law, so Maimonides explains, and this is a traditionally normative Jewish belief, that Jews believe that the world, although today is not 100% the way it needs to be, there will come a time when the world is a better place. No suffering, no jealousy, no anger, no hunger, no war, none of the negative stuff, only good stuff. I will tell you, at the same time, parenthetically, that this is something that I believe every decent human being wants. Every time someone says, what do you wish for the world? World peace. What they're saying is they want Mashiach. They're not saying in those words, but anyone who's ever thought, wouldn't it be nice to live in a world where people could get along, where people wouldn't be so jealous, where people wouldn't hold on to their resources so tightly that they would be open to sharing it with others? That's a world of Mashiach. Now, it says in the good books that the world of Mashiach, this better time of the world, this time of healing of the world, so to speak, is associated with also the higher wisdom becoming revealed. So as we get closer to the time, and it's a Jewish belief that notwithstanding how dark the world seems on a daily basis, especially when you turn on the news, and this murder and this atrocity and this, scandal, whatever. Notwithstanding all of that, the world is progressing and human beings are progressing more and more. And I think even the fact that we call out today things that would be taken for granted even 5 years ago, 20 years ago, not let alone 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 500 years ago, things that would be considered normal. Yeah, that's just people being people, and that happens. Today we say that's not okay, that's not appropriate, and we need to stop that. So that sensitivity itself is an indication that we're getting closer. And as we get closer to a better world, to a more enlightened world, so we have more mystical teachings helping us see greater truths. It's almost like kind of before the party, the closer you get to a party, so you might sample a little bit of the buffet before, especially if you're organizing it. So you'll take, you're cutting up the fruit for the fruit salad. You're gonna pop a grape in and taste it, a piece of watermelon, and you're gonna taste a little bit before. So as spiritually, things get set for, please God, a more enlightened, a more light, a more spiritual reality within the physical dimension. It's not a spiritual, but more spirituality within the physical world. So we get a taste. We get a taste of mysticism. So there is a sense. That's a long way to answer your question, but there is a sense when I teach and when I study and teach, that this is part of a greater movement of spirituality and of enlightenment, of world enlightenment, that is only going to bring positive things to the world. This is only doing, it's only benefiting the world to have teachings like this and groups like this studying. And every Sunday morning we study Kabbalah for an hour and a half, and it's a great way to start the week. And it's like, instead of starting the week with a news report of a political talk show of people screaming at each other, Sunday mornings, this is a way to speak about your soul, to speak about higher things, to speak about purpose, speak about truth, speak about God, speak about deeper ideas, and it's transformative. So I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to have been taught this and to understand it to the extent I understand it, and to be able to share it with others to the point, and I've seen the impact that it's made on people's lives. I mean, people tell me that, because at the end of the day, it's all about making an impact. It's not about theoretical, it's not about Jewish philosophy 101 or Jewish spiritual philosophy. It's not Kabbalah 101. It's about living. It's about being a better parent, being a better spouse, being a better child to your parents. It's about being a better human being to the world. It's about being a better custodian of the world around us. You can't study Kabbalah and learn about the beauty of the world and the divinity and the light in the world, and then litter. It's not a thing. It's like how can you take a world that embedded in the fabric of creation is this divine light, and then spill toxic material on it? Like, how do you do that? So it's not like it's not from the outside in, it's no good because it's harming the planet. I'm just using one example, right? But it's from the inside out. It's like, if this is really a beautiful place filled with light, and my job is to bring out the light and bring out the best and help heal the world, and all of us, all 8 billion of us, are all collectively doing the same thing. So how is it even a possibility that I should harm the world, harm an animal, harm another human being? It's not even a starter. And that's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to Kabbalah. What does it mean practically? What does practical Kabbalah mean? How do I change because of it? I think that we have encountered in our times one of the most puzzling things. And that is, there seems to be, and I don't want to make this political in any way, but it seems to be that the environment, for example, has been politicized. Right? Some are for it, and some are like, nah, that's fake, it's not real, there's no global warming, whatever it is. And I'm not a scientist, but I'll say one thing. I think we've missed the point of the narrative. And those that are trying to sell a pro-environment stance really miss the boat, miss the opportunity. Because it's not like, you don't need to convince people. You tell somebody who believes in God and who believes in the Bible, tell them God created the world, right? How can we destroy it? How can we mess it up? How can we be so callous with it? Anyway, I'm a little bit off topic here, but the point is that Kabbalah is all about practical application and making it real to those that are studying. It's more intentional. It's the more you know, the more you can be empowered to make healthier choices. And the more you see, the more truth you see, the more beauty you see. You see beauty in yourself, you see beauty in others. I mean, we're living in a time where there's also, I would say, a self-esteem crisis. And self-esteem, I think we've gone about that in not necessarily the right way as this, the last 30 years. It's not about giving trophies to everybody necessarily. It's about from a deeper place. It's not about accomplishment, but it's about identity, who we are. And Kabbalah says who we are. If Kabbalah speaks of God and the soul, then half of that equation is this, which is the soul, is about who I am and who you are, who we all are. We have a piece of God inside of us, and we're in the image of God, and that's an amazing thing. That's an amazing gift to carry. So can I really feel down on myself if I'm carrying such an amazing piece inside of me? It's only if I'm not aware of it on a daily basis that I can feel, God forbid, worthless and meaningless and aimless, etc. But if I have these teachings and they're front and center, they're right in front of me, and I'm conscious and consciously aware of it in the moment, then everything is transformed. It's almost like the difference between knowing that you love someone and feeling the love at that moment. So if I know that I love someone, theoretically, I know that I love them, but I'm not feeling the love right now, I could do something that harms them. Because in the moment, right, God forbid, because in the moment, I'm not thinking about my love for them. Like, I know that I love them, but there's this thing that's happening now, and whatever, and I'm going to, whether it's saying something or doing something, whatever it is, I'm going to do something that might harm them because I'm not consciously in the moment aware of it and feeling it right now. But if I meditate on, a loved one, and I think about it, and I allow that thought to fill my heart, and my heart is now filled with love, what are the chances that I'm actually going to hurt them now? Very minimal. So if I'm filled with love for my soul, and love for God, and love for the beauty of the universe, and love for the spirit and light, and all of these wonderful things, I'm less likely to do something that is either self-harmful or harmful for someone else or harmful for the world itself. I'm more likely to do something that is positive for me and for others. So that's some of the transformative impact, generally speaking, of Kabbalah.